Get the volume. Right. Good evening, you're welcome, especially the new faces, Maya and Lisa, and those we haven't seen for a long time, and all those who marched on the 18th of November. How many are here? This evening, this topic before us speaks for itself. A year ago today, momentous things happened in this country. Incredible things. And there were different interpretations of the event. Others say it was a revolution. Others say it is a military-assisted transition. Others said it's soft coup. And many of us in this room said it was a coup. Within an internal coup, which in our view would not change anything. And so, unless there are people with contrary views, so we're speaking about the non-change and the implications of the event of last year. What has happened on the economic front, what has happened on the legal front, constitutional, and which way, what next, what is the likely scenario or scenarios that we expect in the months, in the year ahead. So I have a very erudite team here. I have Tony Rila. Tony is an activist of note, a scholar as well. We've been working together in a platform called the Platform for Concerned Citizens over the last 2 years. And we've been predicting in many ways that which has happened, although we didn't fully understand the ramifications thereof. Fadzai has been here, like Tony, regulars here. Now one of our legal luminaries. Tony will look at the overview of the coup and its overall implications. Fadzai will take us through the constitutional and legal implications thereof. We are hoping that that Tendai Bitim has still arrived. We decided when he arrives what he speaks on. Godfrey Kanyenze, one of our leading economists, is here to reflect on the economic situation since the coup and the possible implications in the months ahead. So, I'll start with Tony. Tony?
Thank you, Nija, and good evening, everyone. Some of you know when I write, I quite like to find catchy titles for things that I write. I couldn't figure out what was the right title for what I was going to say. One was something that my mother would slap me across the wrist for, which is, "We told you so." She always said, that's a cheap shot. If you advise people to do something, not to do something, and they do it and they end up in trouble, it doesn't help to tell them that we told you so. Well, that was the one, but that's floating. The other one was something that, a refrain that followed in the months, the immediate months after the coup, something to the effect of, give them or him a chance and let's see what he or they can do. So somewhere between those two things. And the idea is to try and place the coup in some kind of a history. Ibo said we've been banging on about the risks to Zimbabwe for 2 years. He's actually wrong, it's 3, since I think he wrote a fairly seminal paper about the securocrat state. And in it, he pointed out a whole series of things which actually came to pass. He pointed out the dangers of a fractured state of ZANU-PF, and that unfolded through 2016 and 2017. He pointed out the increased militarization of the state. He pointed out the risk of possible violence from the faction fighting, and even suggested there might be a coup. Well, in fact, that came to pass. I think many of us at that time thought everybody would say that there's no way in Zimbabwe ever you can have a coup. And I think everybody was pretty surprised about that. The refrain, "Give them a chance," came out of, I think, a series of perspectives. And Ibo pointed out that there were very different ways of characterizing what happened. And some of us who were going around trying to speak to different constituencies, to the internationals, were concerned that they were mooting the point. They were saying it's not really a coup. So there was a great ambivalence in them in actually calling a spade a spade. And we think there were 2 reasons really behind it. One was this pressing need, and Godfrey will talk about the slide, for Zimbabwe to stabilize itself. It was critical that Zimbabwe be stabilized. And what was tacked onto that was the idea that it'll all be fine, all we have to do is to have a good election, and everything will come right. Well, we've had the election, and from November last year to now, it doesn't appear, as Jonathan Moyer points out, that the election has cured the coup, and it appears that the country is in a much more difficult position. Certainly, in my perspective, I think we now live, as various people have pointed out, in a more deeply divided Zimbabwe than we have had for a very, very long time, between town and country, between political parties, between all sorts of factions. So we're not better off, and there are lots of calls for unity, but they seem to be a bit high hope, really, that that's going to happen. So, by way of a little history, I'm just going to explain a perspective that was developed in about March last year by a group of people who looked at what was called the popular wisdom at the time. And I think that was summarized by, give them a chance and let's see what they can do. The very bad guy's gone, there will be a big change. And we interrogated what might be the basis for this hope. And we looked at a number of different areas. And each of those areas we saw as critical factors in the, if you want, the state, military, party conflation, and the extent to which some international confidence was that these things would change. So area by area. And this is what I'll call popular wisdom. At the time we said, this is the popular wisdom. And I must say, some of us went out and tested this with various people, and those who were in favor of give them a chance all agreed that these factors were going to work. They were going to happen. There was no doubt. The first one was about the opposition. We were doing this in March last year, and I think the conventional wisdom, the popular wisdom at that time, was that the opposition were completely useless. They were fractured and broken, and they would never mount any kind of credible contest in an election, and were likely to fall apart week by week. Okay? So they're not an alternative at all for an election, probably. The second area that one looked at, and in the aftermath of the coup, was really important, was the security sector. And at the time, in March, we listened to what everyone said, and they said they'll reform, they're self-reforming, the military always do. They're a stabilizing influence, and they're highly professional, and we can pretty much expect them to go back to the barracks and let the party get on with life. ZANU-PF, I think the general popular wisdom was that they were internally cleansing. And as Ivo pointed out, that one of the reasons for this apparent intervention was to save the party from collapse, and now they were in the process of reform. And in reality, when it came to government and elections, they were the only game in town. Another critical area that people were concerned about were the courts. Fadzai obviously going to talk a lot more about that, but I think the view of the group at the time was, well, they're reasonably independent, and there are signs that they're self-reforming. There are much better judgments coming along now, and we can count on the courts in the future. The media, well, we said, you know, it's growing, social media, there's signs that people are going to open their airwaves, etc., etc., etc. So they're pretty good, and they're, through social media and everyone else, they really are guaranteeing freedom of speech. So the media are not a big worry for the future. They will be a wholly different force when elections come around. The non-governmental organizations, civil society, I think the general consensus were that they were disorganized and weak, and not much of a threat, and were very unlikely to become constructive and cohesive, based on, I think, some justifiable history. The church, I think the popular wisdom were the churches are a very important constituency, and they will play a major role, but they need to become much more assertive. And finally, the public, all of us, and in the wake of the events of this time last year, there's general broad acceptance of what's happened. The people are happy with the change, and above all, Zimbabweans are risk averse. They might go out in November 2017 and occupy the street, but they're unlikely to do that on a regular basis, and they're very unlikely to do that when challenging the state. Now, if you went and tested that out in March, and we did with all sorts of different constituents, people said, yep, all of that's true, and therefore the future looks bright. The group that I was with then went and challenged all of those things and said, how many of those things are actually true? Let's take the MDC. Well, some people commented that it's been an enduring party for the best part of a decade. It seems to somehow survive, and maybe there are forces within it that will allow it to become a much more competitive organization. We also pointed out that one of the issues for the MDC was, contrary to the view that ZANU-PF were the only game in town, there were signs that ZANU-PF was actually weakening, and therefore that was an advantage for the MDC, with all the fractures and the splits within ZANU-PF. We were not sanguine, and we did not believe that the security sector was in any process of reforming, and we believed the contrary was true, that they were entrenching themselves in the state. ZANU-PF, we did not believe they were in a process of reform. We believed that they were captured by the military, and that what they were doing was re-entrenching themselves together with the military for a long, long stay in power. The courts, we were somewhat more cynical than the popular wisdom. We did note that there was a tendency amongst the courts to tend to make political decisions for the more difficult decisions that come about. And I think we've seen many of those when things are tough. The courts tend to rule in favor of the state. The media, we poo-pooed the idea that they're opening up in any particular way. There's a huge footprint through social media, but good, concrete, reliable information does not get out very far, and most people are dependent on radio. The NGOs, well, they have the capacity to reform, we felt. And they also have the capacity, we felt, to unify fairly quickly. There have been examples of that in our history, and those of us who remember were struck by memories of how fast civil society came together in the late 90s around the National Constitutional Assembly initiative. So there are some possibilities there. The churches, we saw them again, like everybody else, as highly important actors and very important for resolving the crisis. And the general public, well, we've said there's a honeymoon period. It's pretty much going to come to an end, and fairly soon people are going to get unhappy and see the holes. The popular story that was going around, same bus, new driver, was increasingly a statement being made by ordinary people. So that was the view in March. So those were posed equally. One you could say was optimistic and the other one was pessimistic. So where are we today? Well, the opposition hasn't proved to be a rabble. It's proved to be a very formidable force. May even have won an election. We don't know. But they certainly got people out in huge numbers and without the advantage of massive patronage, and are still continuing to get people out in large numbers. There's no evidence for reform of the security sector, and there's quite clearly an entrenching of the military and the state, just as we predicted. The view that ZANU-PF was captured, we think that that still remains the case, and it seems to us that there still are signs of fracturing within the party. The courts, well, we've been through a whole series of quite complicated decisions recently, and I'm going to leave that to my colleague to talk about in detail, but I think many people were very unhappy with the result of the courts. A little piece of research we just did recently with young women in Bandura, very few of them thought the election was free and fair. And when we asked them the question, did the Constitutional Court decision change your mind? They all said no. We still think the election was not free and fair. The NGOs, well, media, I think there's nothing more to say. It still feels very biased. I think if you're looking at some of the headlines that have gone out this week with the Commonwealth Observer report, you might be living in two countries. The Independent Press says Commonwealth observers do not give it a passing grade, and the Herald says it did. So stories go on as they have done before. The church, I think there are many signs that the church is finally beginning to move and beginning to take the role of some kind of leadership from everything that we can hear. They hold across the board people from both constituencies, all particular parties, and they're seeing their parishes and their parishioners and their constituents suffering more and more and more. So they have a very high motive for engaging, and we hear that they are in fact doing that. Civil society, I don't think we see any strong coming together of civil society yet, but I think there has been a fairly good response by civil society to the post-election events, and certainly the statements and the evidence is coming out to challenge the Commission, even if it's indirectly. And as for the general public, I think all the evidence says, as I pointed out, that we're now deeply divided. Town, country, political parties, north and south, increasing dissatisfaction, movements by Labour to challenge the state over the powerless economy. There's every sign of restlessness and dissatisfaction by the general public with the current government. So in 2016, when some of us posed the notion that there were two ways to deal with the crisis in the state, and one was to negotiate for some kind of transition, what we called the soft landing, or face a hard landing. I think we can conclude from the perspective of November 2018 that we've hit an extremely hard landing and little prospect of any obvious solution for that. And I'll leave you with those thoughts. Thank you.
I hope that in the course of our discussion we can also consider the response of the international community, which, if you recall, as Tony hinted, wouldn't call the coup a coup. They had hoped that the things will even out, the economy improve, the arrears will be cleared, and more important, that the election would in itself cure the coup. And what's fascinating some of us in international relations is the extent to which the international community seems to have consciously disengaged on this Zimbabwe question, including the Britain was very active, shall I say, active participant in the coup. They're very quiet. We hear very little now about the bailout plan, which Boris Johnson mentioned a few days after the coup. And so the financial crunch continues. There's no indication at all of the international bailout, such as was expected. So I'd like to hear from some of you. I see Acting Ambassador Zhao is here. He spoke a few weeks ago. China may be the exception, but even there, the bailout, which was expected when Mnangagwa and his team went to China, has not happened. So what is happening in the international community? Why have you disengaged? Why are you leaving your dual coup to wilt, so to speak? I'd like to hear some views on that. Now, turn to Fazai.
Thank you, Ivo. My comments are going to be strictly from a legal perspective at this stage. I just want to answer a few of the legal questions that have come up since last November. There are quite a few. I'm going to dwell mostly on the role of the military, because I think at this time what's on everyone's mind is whether or not the military has got the power to do the things that it has been seen to be doing in Zimbabwe. What are the proper limits of military power in the exercise of the use of force in this jurisdiction, and what the role of the Constitution is. So I'll start with a question that often comes up, and that came up a lot this time last year: was it a coup? Now my answer to that is that that's not a legal question. The term coup is not a term you'll find in the Constitution or any other piece of legislation. So that's for the political scientists, the international relations scholars to answer. What the question can be from a legal perspective is whether or not the military involvement in November 2017 was constitutional. The answer, which we can now give very freely, which we could not give too freely at the time, is no. There were several violations of the Constitution, although there was a semblance or an attempt to try and clothe the action that was taken with some legality. So it wasn't an out-and-out extra-constitutional takeover where you saw someone from the military usurping the civilian authority and installing himself as a military leader in Zimbabwe. That's not how it happened, which is the classic coup or unconstitutional takeover. What you did see, first of all, is that statement by General S.B. Sibanda. S.B. Moyo, my apologies, there's so many. General S.B. Moyo, my apologies, on ZBC. So the use of the state broadcaster by the military is not something that's sanctioned by law. The military does not have a role in ordinary civilian affairs in a manner that's not sanctioned by the Constitution. The second and more important thing that you saw the day following that publication on the national broadcaster was the deployment of the military. So we saw military tanks on Samora Machel and in a few other areas in town. General S.B. Moyo had told everybody, just keep your movements to a limit. Remember, he didn't say don't go out, don't leave altogether. He said just keep it to a minimum. Churches, opposition, everybody stay calm, we've got this under control. Now that deployment, because its intention was to remove Mugabe at the end, was something that was not sanctioned by Mugabe. I think there's general agreement on that. And in terms of section 213, subsection 1 of the Constitution, only the President can deploy the military or the defense forces, subject of course to the Constitution. So there's no constitutional support for what was done by the military in that regard. But I think a lot of the sentiment at the time was that, look, the end will justify the means ultimately, and the military was extremely careful to ensure that it did not interfere with the ordinary life of people, did not shoot any civilians openly. One can say that the military was extremely disciplined during this period. And then you'll see on the 18th, when the march took place, the military was extremely friendly. They went out of their way to be friendly, taking selfies with the public, looking after you. People could dance and chant outside State House. It was all very fun, but all very unconstitutional. Now, I think it's a timely moment to remind ourselves what the guiding principles of the defense forces are in terms of our Constitution. And the key section here is section 211, particularly subsection 3, which tells us what the defense forces constitutionally must do. The first thing is that they have to be non-partisan. I think we can all say we've been a little bit disappointed with the conduct of the military since 2017, possibly before then, if you want to analyze it. There is a sense, perception that the military is partisan in its character, that it supports the establishment. This sentiment obviously goes back to dates like 2008, where the military openly came out and said we will not salute someone who didn't go to the war. And by that they meant Morgan Tsvangirai, meaning that they would not support any takeover of power that included a person who was not sanctioned by them. So the military has a constitutional obligation not to take a political side. And we've seen increasingly that they are taking political sides. And oftentimes the role of the state and the role of ZANU-PF is conflated in a manner that clearly violates section 211. The second issue is that constitutionally under section 211, the military has to be national in character. Now, we have not seen that enough. We have not seen a sense of serving Zimbabweans broadly by the military. And if you look at some of the statements that were made just over the last few days, you did not get a sense that they were national in character. And you actually see from what a lot of the commentators and scholars have put out, that what the military did in November 2017 was to facilitate a change of guard, as it were, excuse the pun, within ZANU-PF. That is not a job that looks national in character. They obviously have a role to be patriotic. They have a role of being professional. And this takes us to what took place on the 1st of August. There was nothing professional about what took place on that day. First of all, there are very clear constitutional and legal statutory limits for the involvement of the military in the maintenance of public order. What's certainly not permissible is for the military to open fire in a public space arbitrarily and wantonly, as we saw, the classic 45 degrees example, as it were. You saw the military openly shooting, and that's not the wildest protest that we've had in Zimbabwe. So the question that arises is, first of all, it's the role of the police in terms of the Constitution to maintain law and order. What was the military doing there? Who deployed them? And the fact that the military itself can't answer that basic question speaks to a lack of discipline, ergo a violation of their constitutional obligation to be professional that's set out in section 211. You then see under section 211.3, the army is required as a matter of the Constitution to be subordinate to the civilian authority. Now, there certainly is a perception that, sometimes the civilian authority is not fully in control. The fact that Mr. Mnangagwa cannot tell us categorically who deployed the military on that date seems to be a violation of this constitutional provision. Obviously, we wait with bated breath for the findings of the Commission of Inquiry, but it should never be the case that the military is perceived or seen, or in fact participates in civilian life and civilian rule in the manner that we've seen since November 2017. And I think the shift that took place post-coup is that the military was a lot more brazen about its involvement. And sometimes that's direct involvement, and sometimes it's more, subtle, where someone retires from the military and, goes straight to the Ministry of Lands, gets deployed to key public service posts. Their participation in the running of national resources, be it diamonds, agriculture, command agriculture, the role of the soldiers there, the role of the army and the soldiers, the defense forces in the running of elections. We all heard reports in the rural areas, particularly of the involvement of soldiers there. So I think those guiding principles set out in 2011, in Section 211, exist for a reason, and it's important for us always to hold the defense forces to that constitutional standard and make sure they do the right thing. The final thing that I wish to say is that there was a semblance of legality in November 2017. You saw an attempt to impeach the president using Parliament and Senate. Certainly the ball started to roll in that direction. You also saw that the two other arms of the state, aside from the executive, so the judiciary and Parliament, remained firmly in force. Certainly the High Court sat within a few days of the coup. There was at no point the suspension of the Constitution, as can happen in terms of the Constitution. There was no declaration of a state of emergency. So you did not see the military take over those two arms of government. You also see that the face of the coup, Mr. Mnangagwa, is a civilian, so he didn't come straight from the defense forces, which is something, again, and his takeover, the fact that he was reinstated as vice president of ZANU-PF, there was an attempt to comply with those provisions in the Constitution set out in Section 97 around the removal of the president. So there were attempts to comply with the Constitution. In my respectful view, they weren't substantial, which takes me to the order by Justice Chiweshe to the effect that the coup was constitutional, or the takeover, however you'd like to phrase it. The difficulty of the position we find ourselves in is that there's no judgment to explain or reasons given for that judgment. It was an order by consent. And when you see, a matter of such importance, I would say it's desirable to try and get a judgment with reasons. This wasn't the first time in this jurisdiction that there was an extra constitutional takeover of power. We saw it again in 1965 with UDI, and the role of the courts then was quite different from what it is now, in the sense that the courts went as far as writing a full reasoned judgment in the case of Mazimba Muto versus Lardner Burke, talking about whether or not they perceived the coup or the takeover to be lawful. They spoke to the doctrine of necessity and other constitutional and jurisprudential doctrines. We are yet to see from our courts a similar judgment. I'm not going to waste too much time analyzing the constitutional decision relating to the election. I think that's something that's been hashed out over and over, and I think, everyone has their view on that.
What's your view on it? Tell us now.
It would have been ideal. Okay, so one positive thing that came out is that the Constitutional Court did not decide the matter on a technicality. Sometimes with the superior courts, they do decide matters on technicalities. That was good. They weren't sticklers for the time limits. I think, there's debate around the quality of the application that was placed before the courts, whether or not the founding affidavit had all the necessary evidence to support the conclusions that were desired. I didn't read the founding affidavit myself, but there was a need, in my view, to maybe attach those V11s to ensure that, there was no doubt, as it were, as to what actually took place. What I found disappointing from all parties and all actors is that no one can tell us what the correct number of votes each respective candidate obtained. Not a single one of the actors, the courts, the parties, no one can tell us with the evidence to say that, look, X got these votes, Y got these votes, Z got these votes, which I find difficult. I think I'll stop there. I'll stop there, Ivo, if you'll allow me.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think we've had a very useful outline and a reminder of the events of last year. I think that there's more clarity in your position a year afterwards than the previous presentation when the debate was still raging. And it appears that there's a coincidence of views between the legal outline you gave and the political scientist's view of the events. It was a coup.
Godfrey. Okay, thanks very much, Ipo. I just want to stand back and start by not talking about Zimbabwe, but reflecting on where the discourse of economic development is. I think it's very fundamental and critical so that we can use that framework to interrogate what's happening in Zimbabwe. You may recall that Zimbabwe, like most developing countries, implemented structural adjustment programs in the 90s and so forth. It created a lot of challenges. There was so much acrimony, fighting and all those things, the pain, the poverty and so forth. As a result, a lot of stakeholders, including the World Bank itself, were engaged in a reflection of what the challenges were. You may recall that in 2005, the World Bank came up with a seminal document on 2 decades of structural adjustment. What are the lessons learned? And what is very, very critical is that the first important principle they highlighted was the very fact that structural adjustment programs were top-down, they were imposed from above. And hence the emphasis was, without national ownership, programs have got little chance for success. The same principle was highlighted, was emphasized, when again the World Bank put together a team, a global team of experts under the Growth Commission of 2008. They looked at success stories, countries that have sustained growth, experienced sustained growth over a period of more than 25 years. And again, they highlighted the same principle, that national ownership is fundamental. In the 2005 report, the World Bank also said something so profound, because the mantra then was that you stabilize the economy, you privatize, and you liberalize. Eureka, everything falls into place. So here the World Bank emphasizes that we were wrong. Just liberalizing is not a growth strategy. It's very critical, especially when we engage the narrative that we are having now in Zimbabwe of just opening for business. They highlight the experiences of countries like China, where Deng Xiaoping's dictum was you cross the river by grouping for the stones. Development is a process of discovery. Development is a process of, first of all, highlighting the key obstacles and addressing those key obstacles without addressing everything else. Remember, the Washington consensus basically gave us a shopping list and we had to deal with all those. The argument basically was developing countries don't have the capacity to look at all those. You look at the most binding constraints. That was a key lesson. And these lessons were distilled in the OECD. Remember the OECD 5 principles on aid effectiveness, the Paris Declaration on aid effectiveness, where they highlighted again that government-led processes with stakeholder participation is critical, national ownership. The second one, harmonization. Everyone then harmonizes what they are doing with their agreed position, alignment, and then reporting for results, and mutual accountability. This has been extended in 2011 through the Busan principle on development. It moved from aid now to development effectiveness, where they came up, distilled 3 principles which are critical. The first one, democratic ownership. It's critical to ensure that there is inclusivity. No one is left behind. If you leave groups behind, then you've got challenges. Then the second one, of course, I have highlighted inclusivity and accountability. The very fact that the partners must be mutually accountable to each other. Now, fast forward to where we are now in Zimbabwe, following the coup. The narrative was quite interesting. And I can understand why, it was very easy, especially for the international community to fall for it. Because the economic strategy or narrative was the antithesis of Mugabe's position. We stand for everything that Mugabe, if Mugabe stood for, took an anti-imperialist, anti-engagement position, our position is the opposite. We stand for re-engagement. We stand for market-driven economies. We stand for repaying our debts. We stand for compensating white farmers. We stand for, and it goes on and on until the clarification of on the indigenization issues. That no, it won't apply to everything else. It won't apply to platinum and diamonds. That was the new narrative. And what is also quite interesting, up front, we were told then that we have overly focused on the politics, governance, at the exclusion of the economy. Now we want to focus on the economy. And I think there's a challenge there of forcefully drawing a line between politics, governance, and the economy, where you can say, let bygones be bygones. Bygones can't be bygones when you are in a state like Tony has correctly characterized, a highly fragile, a highly broken, a highly polarized environment. And if you are in such a context with people that are hating, the people in the southern part of Zimbabwe are talking not about, all these things that we're talking about, the economy and so on. They're saying we are hating. We need a closure to some of the issues that have taken place, the legacy issues, the issues of Kukura Mundi, the issues of governance, all these challenges, all the governance challenges that we've experienced. So when you have a polity that is broken and that is hating, and you want to move forward, it's quite a big challenge now. You say, let's move to the economy. Because the economy cannot move as long as you haven't addressed all these issues. And I think it's a very clear message also that's coming from some of the broken countries like Colombia, where they are highlighting, emphasizing the importance, first of all, of nation building, of cohesion building, creating a cohesion. Right now, we already have a vision, 2030. I don't know how many people participated in developing Vision 2030. It's just a very, very loose vision, of aspiring to be a upper middle income country by 2030. And what does it mean? It simply means a country with a per capita income of 3,500 up to around 15,000 per capita. I mean, there are a lot of countries that are in that category, but they are not, in terms of human development, it's not a thing to aspire towards. Because what is critical are the conditions of equality and inequality. If you've got high levels of inequality and you have 15,000 per capita, it's meaningless when the majority of the people are not enjoying that. So when you look at all visions I've been working in Rwanda and other places, a vision has got at the center of it aspirations of the people. Because development is about people and the aspirations that they have. So in essence, we can't just aspire to have just one goal of just being an upper middle income country with a per capita income of 3,500. And that's the indicator that we keep on using. And the vision must be shared. That's part of the challenge with the current vision. And even our president himself, I think, indicated that he developed this when he was border jumping. He said, I was just border jumping and I just came up with the idea. This is how we are going to move as a country. We are going to, So there hasn't been any proper interrogation or reflection, in terms of developing, designing that vision. A vision must be shared. It must be broad-based. I've already highlighted the international principles that are critical for it. Then the mantra Zimbabwe is open for business. I've already intimated that the World Bank itself has already critiqued the traditional social adjustment programs where emphasis was just opening up. Can you imagine a country now saying that, what is your strategy? We are opening our doors. Anyone can come in. Anything can come in. So that is hardly a building plank for development. You can't say you've got a developmental strategy where you are just emphasizing that we liberalize, we just open our doors for business. And I think there's a lot of lack of clarity. We saw it after the monetary policy and fiscal policy measures that were announced on the 1st of October, where local businesses were saying, but where are we? You're not even talking about us. It seems like the focus is on FDI, foreign direct investment. And this also has got a very critical implication in terms of our development framing, where we are literally outsourcing our development, expecting that a foreign direct investment will come and develop us. We're almost like surrendering. We have forgotten about the none but ourselves mantra. We are forgetting about the very fact that development is our responsibility as Zimbabweans. So the first and most important thing that we should have done as Zimbabweans is to have national dialogue. To have national dialogue where we agree in terms of the problems that we are faced with, and the solutions, where we want to go as a nation, we haven't had that. And the solutions basically are contrary to the wisdom that I've already highlighted, which has been distilled from the lessons from experience, where without broad-based participation, and the elections have already shown us the extent of brokenness, isn't it? The urban centers areas are controlled by the MDC. Whether you like it or not, that is a fact that the current government must acknowledge that when you want to move, you have to acknowledge the very fact that the opposition is in control of the urban areas, urban centers, and you are in control. Your social base is in the rural areas and so forth. So, in essence, if you want to push programs that have got an impact because of the trade-offs in policies, you are likely to get opposition, especially in urban settings. The World Bank has already shown through the evidence that we hardly talk about it. Since the crisis emerged in the new millennium, there's been a net urban to rural migration. Why? Simply because urban poverty is excruciating, it's very painful. In the urban centers, you have to pay literally for everything. You have to pay for your electricity, for your sanitation, for your water you drink, for transport, for housing. So if you don't have a job, you literally cannot survive in an urban setting. And hence, what we've seen is a net migration of almost 1.14 million, according to the World Bank, people from urban areas to rural settings. It has been also exposed to the land reform program. So what that essentially means, therefore, is that if you are in this context of brokenness, and basically you come up with top-down approaches, you have already seen examples of how it is failing. You recall, our approach basically is going back to what we experienced in the 80s, where the one personal, very powerful economic star, Bernard Chizero. We're going back to personalities again. Now we've got him Mtuli. Look at his credentials. He's a professor coming from Oxford. We're reminded easily about all these things. And I mean, he was excited as well when he announced these fiscal measures, and only to realize the response. We're in a worse situation after the events, after the measures that were announced, where essentially on the 1st of October, government separated bank accounts with the Nostro foreign currency accounts and the FCA, and the RTGS Nostro accounts. So effectively, we told everyone that there is good money and bad money, and the majority of the people are sitting on bad money. So essentially, what we saw is a situation where the majority of Zimbabweans clearly showed Mtuli that they understand economics better than he does. Because what the people simply did is, I'm sitting on bad money, I have to get rid of this bad money, Gresham's law, and get hold of the good money. And then where they run, where everyone now is on the streets, where the foreign currency is. And we saw what happened, the premium increased 600%. And as a result, everyone, including business sectors, could not operate. Even up to now, we're still feeling the effects, of those measures, where now the majority of the retailers were failing to find the foreign currency to retool. Everyone is now in the medical sector demanding payment in foreign currency, and yet the reality is that the majority of our people do not have access to that foreign currency. So in essence, if you look at what has happened now, as a result of this top-down approach, without any consultations, even when still within government itself, you saw what happened, the reaction of those that have been shunned to the party, the Chinamasas, the Obetumpofos. They came up with a press conference and said, no, we're not consulted. We want to remind Mtuli that we are the ones with the social base. We are the ones who were voted for. And we are now, from now onwards, this is a new structure. It wasn't there in the past. We didn't have full-time people sitting in the party offices overseeing government. Now we are going to watch closely at what the government is going to do. So you can see already the fractures that we were talking about, the fault lines. And the very fact that later on we saw something else, another illustration of the challenges with the top-down approach. Well, actually, Lumumba thought he was very smart and clever. He hired S. Lumumba to make a statement. He was afraid to make the statement, obviously. So he called S to make the statement. And S told us that the economy is being run by cartels, which was frightening. That the central bank basically is also captured. That, in fact, the procurement, all the facets, the resources are captured by cartels. And these cartels are so powerful. And we saw what happened immediately. The fights within the same government. The Minister of Information fighting back that their role has been usurped through the appointment of S. Lumumba. And immediately, Mutuli Ngube learned very quickly. He had to drop S Lumumba. And so it clearly shows us the challenges of trying to move in a minefield. You can't run in a minefield. You need, first of all, as I've highlighted, to go backwards. Then the other aspect, in conclusion, that I also want to focus on is the way we operate illegally. The issues of legitimacy have been highlighted. I find it quite worrisome that even in the fiscal measures or in the budgets, the Minister of Finance has got the audacity to stand up and say, guys, look here, our debt is more than 70% of GDP, we are breaking the law. Our overdraft facility with the Reserve Bank at 2.3 billion is 3 times over the limit, we are breaking the law. We are literally breaking the law. We are not even, the debt, the way we are acquiring new debt, we didn't have domestic debt. 2013, in fact, through hyperinflation, we had wiped off domestic debt. But 2013, domestic debt amounted to 275 million. And now can you imagine, in a short space of time, we have accumulated 9.5 billion domestic debt. And it exceeds foreign debt, which is 7.4. Already we are saying foreign debt, we are already having problems with servicing that foreign debt of 7.4 billion. But now all of a sudden we even have a bigger domestic debt of 9.5, with giving us a total of debt of 16.9 billion. Lack of transparency in terms of the way this debt is being acquired. Last year alone, during the tenure, we're talking about the 1 year with the military, since the removal of Mugabe in November last year. Government during this period acquired domestic debt of more than around 5 billion in a short space of time. It's not transparent, it's not accountable. They're supposed to go through parliament, but it doesn't. And then we ask ourselves, where is this 9.5 billion gone? What have we done? When you acquire such debt, you should be able to say, look at the railways, look at the roads, look at something that we've done, look at the electricity that we're generating now. It's difficult to point at what this money is done. And then what does government do? They come back to us and say, guys, look here, we've got a problem on our hands. Now we've got a smart, nutty professor at the helm. He says he calculates and finds that he can easily raise money. Then they come up with a 2% levy on every transaction. Every one of us must now pay for something that we don't even know where it is gone, what has been done with that, So we have got fundamental challenges, especially with the way we are operating illegally. We are breaking all the principles, as I have highlighted, the norms, the standards that are emerging from lessons from experience with implementing programs. And right now we're in a scenario where we're gridlocked, nothing can move. Even you can see now, even the Minister of Finance is hesitant now. It's very difficult to move following what has happened, the challenges that have been created by the measures that were implemented on the first. We all can actually, I think, testify that we are worse off now than we were before the announcement of these measures that were that came through post-election, through the post-election policy frameworks that were announced unilaterally and so forth. So that's for me a major challenge that we have as a country, where we are not even following basic tenets of good economic management, principles of, first of all, dialogue, building consensus around whatever policy programs we come up with as a nation. As long as we continue along this path. Lastly, we saw now, after the crisis, the turmoil, the president has responded by establishing an advisory council. And it's only made up of business people. And yet we are saying that you need to be more inclusive. The dialogue needs to encompass all critical stakeholders in this nation. So I'll rest my case there. Thank you.
Yeah, before we open the discussion, just briefly, my panel, you try and answer the question, Whither, Zimbabwe? What is, Tony, what do you think are the likely scenarios of the next few months? Fadzai, Tony, what are the likely constitutional developments, if any? Can you expect anything that moves towards curing the coup? And what is the fate of the new constitution of 20, not so new now, 2013, which as you know has not been implemented. And we made no reference to it. And Godfrey, although you have already hinted, maybe a more specific indication of, first and foremost, what does this 2% thing mean? What it's meant to achieve? If it does not achieve what it's meant to achieve, what are the likely implications, especially with respect to the international financial institutions, not to mention our balance of payment position. So, Tony?
I think crystal ball gaze is very dangerous, but anyhow.
Try.
Okay, I think Godfrey's pointed out that we are in deadlock. We're deadlocked with our policies, but we're also in deadlock politically, where the two major parties who have quite, certainly they have political and social bases, are at loggerheads. And I suspect they're going to continue. My view is what the MDC is doing is they're pushing as hard as they possibly can to force discussion about a political settlement. And the question is, how long will that take before you get to that particular point? And the critical thing at that particular point is what actually happens then. I think there's a general sense amongst the citizens that they do not want another GPA. They don't want an elite pact, but I'm not certain they know what else there is. But I think the only way forward in this thing will be some kind of national dialogue to produce some kind of transitional arrangement. We've been shouting about that for a very, very long time. But this time around, I think the political forces are much more balanced because the government is weak politically and it's also weak economically. So at some point, my guess is they're going to have to start talking. And we hear quite a lot of public statements about they want to talk and they don't want to talk. But I would guess there's a fair amount of below the radar screen chatting between the two groups about how they try to get to some point of political agreement. But the timing on that can go on for...
Okay, so I've got 6 things that I would like to see. Firstly, we have to return to strict constitutionalism. The government should not act outside the clear parameters of the Constitution. The military should participate or perform its constitutional role. It should not slide into civilian government arena. We should not see that optically or in practice. There's very important constitutional provision that should permeate government conduct, Section 68, which talks about administrative justice. Inter alia, the public administration has a constitutional obligation to act legally, reasonably, and in a substantively and procedurally fair manner. So we can't have ministers like the Minister of Finance acting outside the law and being brazen about it. They have to act within the limits set out in the law. Then also, there has to be greater parliamentary scrutiny over the executive. You can't have all these deals being signed and then your legislators not reading through the fine print and looking through. They've got a constitutional and parliamentary obligation to go through these deals and to question the ministers. Those committees need to be a lot more effective than they're being now. The NPA, the National Prosecution Authority, they should investigate before they arrest. We've seen too many arrests and not enough convictions. They have to properly, genuinely, in a bona fide manner, investigate corruption that's taken at a grand level. This must not be done selectively. They've got a constitutional obligation to act independently of the executive, so we can't continue to see an NPA or National Prosecution Authority that's subject to the whims of the president or the executive and working in the office of the president. That's unconstitutional. And if we're to go back to constitutionalism, it has to stop. Constitutional bodies should be given genuine autonomy and power to perform their functions. Chief amongst these is the Anti-Corruption Commission. It's been a toothless bulldog for too long. It's been partisan for too long. It has not been national in character. It's been silent in the face of grand corruption, only to be used when factional fights start. That has to stop. Also, the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, there are a lot of damning reports that have come from the international community, but also any lawyer looking here can look at what the violations that took place were. We have to get to a place where ZEC is fully empowered or carries out the reforms that are necessary to comply. And it shouldn't be a question of waiting for the opposition to say, please reform. They should just look at the terms of the Electoral Act, look at the terms of the Constitution and start fixing all the mistakes they made, and not to wait to do so until a year before 2023. The work really has to start now. And then finally, the citizens have an obligation to participate politically. I think it would be a huge matter of regret if citizens who are very engaged at the moment slid back into apathy. We've got all these political rights, the right to challenge every policy, any policy you wish of the government. That's a right that you've got in terms of Section 67. So we need to be on our guard. We need to make sure and keep our watch over the executive and ensure that there's not an abuse or excess of government power. I think that's my 6-point plan for us. Thank you.
Thanks, Ibo. It's already clear what will happen with respect to the transaction tax 2%. The president has made it, has announced that they're going to review it in the budget.
But we don't know what's going to happen. Yeah.
So, however, without national dialogue and agreed position, in the shared position on the economy, we don't have a counter argument, which implies therefore that we are in the clashes of the IFIs. And the roadmap is already clear. That the Bali, roadmap, areas clearance, and debt resolution, where we are now basically expected to clear the areas.
The Lima plan?
The Lima now Bali, Indonesia.
Oh, okay, Bali.
Yeah.
Oh, Bali.
Yeah.
Bali
The Lima process stalled and it has been invigorated basically through the Bali meetings, where we've agreed now to clear the areas, the World Bank, African Development Bank, and the European Investment Bank, areas totaling $2.5 billion. And the Minister of Finance is committed to do so in 12 months. So he said, we are going to do it, and we'll do it in 12 months. So you can imagine, look at the fiscal situation where we are in, where basically we are failing to raise sufficient revenues to even pay salaries. Employment costs in 2017 gobbled more than 95% of the revenues. Last year it went down slightly to 90%. So essentially, where you've got a budget which basically is even struggling to meet one activity, one expenditure, which is employment costs, and add to that now the imperative of clearing the areas of 2.5 billion. The expectation, of course, is that there could be some benefactor who can just come and assist us. You remember there's been this talk, you gave that example of the British Labour Party, that guy, what is his name?
Boris Johnson.
Yeah, they came here promising that they can assist to raise money. So the challenge basically is that we may have to find someone who can give us a line of credit, which is in essence is tantamount to digging a hole in order to fill another hole. You have to borrow in order to meet, which is not really resolving the challenge. So we are in a very difficult predicament in terms of the economy, where if we follow this route, it's very clear that even after clearing the areas, you don't qualify to get lines of credit. Then you have to come up with a clear track record of implementing reforms. I was doing some work in Rwanda. They started this process in 2000, and they only got debt relief in 2006. You need that's a clear HIPIC sort of route if you want debt relief and areas clearance. So essentially what it would therefore mean is that after clearing those areas, you need now to undertake the reforms that are actually embedded in the transitional stabilization program, which is essentially SR2. Privatization, rolling back the state, retiring people, and all those measures that are highlighted in terms of reducing even the size of the state, retrenchment in the public sector, which is highly contentious. As you know, this falls under the realm of political economy. But the minister is not even talking of processes of consultation, of consulting the trade unions, the public sector, etc. He has already come up with a roadmap, which is now saying that we're going to privatize 11, close down 11, departmentalize 7 of the parastatals, etc., etc. So that's part of the challenge going forward, where without, consultations, dialogue, then it's going to be a lot of conflicts that are ahead of us.
Let's go. Right, Flo, Daniel Shumba, see you ready to talk. Don't worry, just speak as it is.
Oh.
You're a parliamentarian. You can stand up if you wish.
Okay. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share an introspect on the issues that we are discussing today. I share your views, all of them, but would like maybe to give us a little synopsis as to a bit of the history. We did have a coup in November. I am a retired senior army officer, and I know the tenets of the Defense Act and the provisions of Section 211. I'm a former parliamentarian, and we debated these issues. The provisions of Section 213 were not provided. The President Mugabe at the time, did not order the troops to take him out. So it was a coup. It's wrong to mislead everybody and try to gloss over the reality of what it was. We did sit as parliament, and of course you know the whipping system in Zimbabwe, where political parties whip their members to vote in a certain way. So obviously the first motion for the impeachment was moved by James Maridadi earlier, 2 years earlier, which was thwarted by ZANU-PF because of the majority in parliament. This particular one was then moved because it was meant to sanitize the coup so that it would appear as if it was something else. It was hush-hush. Even the process of impeachment was not done properly, because you notify, you list the issues, and you get a response, you interview, and you bring the person that is accused to defend themselves. So it was going to take something like 3-4 months to conclude an impeachment process. Other countries have done it. It has taken up to 6 months. In Zimbabwe's case, the military were already simultaneously putting pressure on Mugabe, threatening to break into his blue roof house. In the meantime, parliamentarians who were being whipped into line agreed, the opposition and everybody, that let's push for this. But what is important to note is, how did Mnangagwa become the benefactor? Remember, at the time I was still a Politburo member in ZANU-PF, the party that had fired him. The process of getting engaged back into the party requires a disciplinary process to take place. And I mentioned this in my papers at the Constitutional Court, and the judges did not want to hear that. In fact, I was the only respondent whom the judges did not want to cross-examine because of what I would have put out. Mnangagwa could not legally have been a benefactor of the coup because he was not even a member of ZANU-PF at the time. Poko was. So that's one scenario. Secondly, who called for the Central Committee meeting? Because only the president, the vice presidents, and the national chairman would. None of them were available to do that. Mugabe was quarantined at his house. Poko was out of the country. Mnangagwa had been fired. We didn't have a national chairman. So ZANU-PF violated its own constitution. And therefore, everything that followed is voidable at law. And therefore, it was a surprise when they fired 26 members in December for being G40, because whoever fired them could not have done it legally. I attempted to attend the Central Committee meeting. I was blocked by the army at ZANU-PF, and the tank was there. As head of delegation to the European Parliament for ACP-EU, I left Zimbabwe to go to a regional meeting in Haiti. While I was there was Congress in Zimbabwe. And confirmed the expulsion of the 26 members. And they said, oh, yeah, you forgot Daniel Shumba. Anotipa problem. Include him on the what? On the list. That's how I got expelled from ZANU-PF. And I remained a member of parliament. I was the chair of the Mines and Energy Portfolio Committee. You are aware from answered reports that I dealt extensively on the issues of aligning the laws in mining, but more particularly on the issue in relation to the Reconstruction Act. One of the challenges which people don't talk about is that Zedera is clear about what a nation, what Zimbabwe ought to do in order to qualify and not have Zedera implemented on it. And one fundamental issue is aligning your own laws with your own constitution. We haven't done that. We've got POSA, IPA, the Reconstruction Act, and a plethora of other statutory instruments that are violating and which are corruptly being used by the ZANU-PF government. I stated when I was chair about the importation of duty-free fuel for use by the private sector, unilateral declaration of national project status, and so forth. These records are there in Parliament, and so it is also wrong for people to assume that in ZANU-PF you do not have intellectuals that fight for this thing, fight for the correct thing. Unfortunately, we are greatly outnumbered, and the consequences are real. You get fired like I was on the 18th of January. Now, I want to agree with advocate. There's been a series of coups, but coups didn't start and end with the 2017. Yes, 1965, but in ZANU-PF, 1975, Ndamaningi Stole was kicked out by a coup. Basically, Bob and Juru hooked up and said, well, you're out. That's a coup. What happened to the 1979 Congress in Mozambique? When Togogara was pushing that Congress be held in Zimbabwe. Somehow he didn't make it. What was that? It's a coup. So there've been a series of these things. Now, these are politically defined coups. Zimbabwe has been suffering on a lot more than just the political coups. The enactment of these laws, and I'll deal more specifically with the Reconstruction Act, it's meant to expropriate, usurp, and plunder the wealth and assets of others. And I've been an advocate on that issue. Now, leading to the ingoings of ZANU-PF, I mentioned this, that the funding of all these operations are being funded by money that is being taken away from anybody they disagree with. That is why, for instance, SMM was targeted. And now Mawere is in the diaspora. His assets were taken away by a law that is ultra various every tenet of our 2013 Constitution. That is what Mnangagwa used to explain his campaign strategy in Mashaba. They've now used it to ensure that creditors don't have access to their monies. They've usurped the powers provided to an entity, a company, through the Companies Act, and rendered all the provisions of the Companies Act and the Insolvency Act void because of this new super act that was coined by Chinamasa and his cronies, which is now being used to usurp the powers of the judiciary, because a minister of justice can unilaterally issue an order of reconstruction and declare that there is state indebtedness. Who does not have state indebtedness? If you are indebted in terms of your water bill, your telephone bill, you are indebted to the state. And if for some reason the ZANU-PF elite decide that they're going to take over your company, they will do it. And the judiciary does not have powers over the administrator of the reconstruction. Now, I'd like also to mention that what is happening at Air Zimbabwe, again, it's the same process. What is happening in Hwange is the same process. Where government, with its cartels, decides that they're going to give this to one of their cronies, and if you refuse, we reconstruct this company, kick away the board. Only the Companies Act has provisions for that. Anything else is illegal. But they do it anyway. And give a certain concession that would have given Hwange another 100 years to some business person, I believe it's Billy Rottenberg, in furtherance to the plunder and looting and corruption that has been taking place from the DRC days to now. Now this country cannot continue to listen to these economists and think they're joking. And we clap in here and go home and hope that tomorrow a miracle will happen. We ought to take responsibility of these things. We ought to share this discourse. We ought to agree that such an important forum as this one, and I thank you, Nkoma, this is opening the eyes of many people, because we tend to confine our discourse to very limited aspects of our nationhood. We don't introspect to find out how has the judiciary been captured in Zimbabwe. Most of you saw me, I represented myself at the Constitutional Court. I was willing to tell them, how did Malava swear in Mnangagwa without asking how he became the candidate to be sworn in? And then you ask him to preside over the very beneficiary that he already is anointed? I had all that in the papers. Now we've got to agree that the international community compromised this country to a very great extent by trying to romance ZANU-PF in the hope that things will happen and change. If things can't change, there are two things you can do. Surrender and let them do what they want and let this be a pariah state. Or stand up and say no. If you're a coward, you're going to die many times before your actual death. Mnangagwa is not legitimate. Nobody can trust him. Not even the Chinese can trust him when they know that there are several assets from Zimbabwe and monies that are in China which are ill-gotten. His relationship with the army comes from a long time ago. They then romanced each other at the Chiazwa diamond fields. And I tell you this as a fact, as chairman of Mines and Energy. They plundered the wealth of Zimbabwe. You are all destitutes. Don't look at the color of suits you're wearing. Because they're not worth anything. Now, unless we agree that to move forward, the aspect of constitutionalism must be upheld by everybody in this country. The issue of corruption has to be dealt with. Because now Mnangagwa can't deal with the other cartel because he's got his own cartel. It's about who's eating the most or who's got a bigger chunk. The argument he put. Who doesn't know who's externalizing the most gold out of this country? Who doesn't know that? I don't want to talk about issues I raised in my manifesto during my political campaign. I only had 5 months. I didn't hope to win the election, but I hope to prepare for the next election extensively. But what is critical now is Zimbabweans. This forum has provided us an opportunity to look at these illegal laws, to publicly stand up and let the judiciary know that we know that this country's judiciary is captured. That is why they can allow a Minister of Justice to issue a reconstruction order and only confirmed by the court, and that whatever he decides, if he decides that you're in violation of anything, he will. He can sequestrate you, specify you. He can get you arrested. So we must be scared. Yes, we are scared. But I'm so scared of being scared, I decided to stand up. And I urge you all to understand that let's deal with the litany of illegalities and constitutionalism. Thank you very much.
Right. I had prior arrangement with Daniel Schubert to speak, but we thought it would be a full panel, so that's why I gave him the wrong. I shan't repeat that. So, the gift.
Yeah, the criminalization money is directed to
Kanyenze.
Kanyenze, yeah. The criminalization of the parallel market, I mean, in your view, do you think it's going to impact on the supply side of the forex?
Sure one? Another one? Oliver?
Yes, I don't quite remember the gentleman's name there, but
Daniel Shumba.
Shumba.
Lion.
Yes, Shumba and the lady
Fazai.
Fazai. In their talk, there's one thing that runs through, and there's something called impunity. And there are multiple impunities right, left, and center. One impunity by one group, another impunity by someone else, and so things go on and on and on in a muddled manner. How do we address this scenario of multiple impunities that seem to feed on each other and unravel it and have a sense of respect for the law, respect for the constitution? Because that's going against those is what impunity is as far as I'm concerned. Then the other thing is, he touched on something that probably has not been adequately addressed, and that is the role of the resident. Is it number 19 or 16, 1600 or 1900 Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, and that's Trump and the American policy and how it affects us. I think that is a side that we may do a lot of things or say a lot of things that we think we will do to achieve progress or come out of this economic scenario. But that constituency, America can pull the rug from us. They're doing it elsewhere. They're doing it on Iran. And who are we to be able to get out of it on our own without having to address those concerns?
Thank you. One more before I ask my panel. Derek?
Yes, I don't know if I'm the only person in this room who's amazed by the people who've been chucked out of ZANU-PF, who become super critical of the policies they help to implement. Mr. Shumba mentioned the capture of the judiciary. One of the other institutions that people feel has been captured is the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission. But correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Shumba, you were part of the parliamentary committee that went through this farcical appointment process of the election of the majority of the people on ZEC. True or false?
There is only one person. And are you expecting a response from him?
I can give you quickly.
Yeah, correct.
Parliament has got a structure which has got the top, like a board of directors of Parliament. It's called the CSROC. I was a member of that. And in that one, there was a subcommittee for legal and procedure, which myself, Chinamasa, and Chamisa were a part of. As a consequence, we, as parliamentarians, Chamisa and myself, were part of the team that headed our respective political party interest in the interviews of all the Chapter 12 and Chapter 13 institutions, including ZEC. Yes. What we did is we followed the process, advertising. And I mentioned this in one of my presentations, so it's available on internet and YouTube. So I mentioned that we did the best with what came. And I didn't want to be insulting to the quality that came. But what we picked for the president to then go from the 12 that we gave President Mugabe, he chose 8. Now, that was the cream of what came. I believe in Zimbabwe we lack active citizenry. We lack active citizenry. And so you do get same people recycled on boards and everywhere. So it is something that civic society can assist in terms of advocacy to try and allow this. Now, naturally, the president chose the 8, but Parliament does not choose the chair. That is the prerogative of the president. So after Judge Makarau resigned, the new president put Judge Chigumba. My averments are, he himself was illegal, and therefore appointing a crony in Judge Chigumba was simply complicating an already complicated process. So I agree with you that first I know that ZEC has got several members of intelligence, several members of the military in it. Some I know personally, some I don't. And we challenge that as opposition parties. And so you're right to be concerned. We can't expect them to be fair in any respect. You mentioned that it is possible, is it people just become clever? No, I've always been. I've been a businessman of the year. I'm a founder of Econet. I started Teleaccess. I started the first black IT company, Systems Technology. So I am a businessman of note.
Thanks,
yeah. And so being in ZANU-PF was also my democratic right. The fact that I didn't like what I found, I fought it until I got kicked out. Thank you.
I think I'll take more questions, and then I'll ask my panel to round off. Yes, sir. Your name? Your name, please, sir.
My question is directed.
Your name, I said.
My question is directed to the advocate. We know the state has got a number of apparatus, which includes the military, police, and I'm sure it is common knowledge whenever there is a collapse of the government system, there is an apparatus which is supposed to intervene in national interest, which I believe is what happened during this time last year when the military intervened. We are all aware the whole nation rallied behind the military across the political divide. And the issue was referred to the court, which ruled that what happened was constitutional. But today you just informed us that no, that was unconstitutional. Fast forward to August the 1st, you again said the involvement of the military was unconstitutional. But from the interview which was conducted by the commission, we heard that the intervention was as a result of a number of consultations started from the police and the military. So probably may need to shed more light. Are you saying the military should remain in the barracks and do nothing when there is chaos and when everybody is being threatened security-wise?
I'll take 3 more. Caleb?
Yeah. Okay, I was just going to comment that, okay, we thought we...
Comment on the military involvement.
Okay, to me it was a transition, it was not a coup, so I am not one of... But anyway, what I wanted to say is, we're all pointing out what is not going right. What we thought would be, say, on policy, are we getting better in terms of policy, whether in business or in what? Are we getting better in this area and this area? Because if it's this war, Zimbabweans, I think, nobody is going to run this country for us. If you are in a war, we say, if this teamwork is not working, this is not working, this is not working, this is not working, then when are you there? You have to see, maybe this is not working, this is what we're going to do, this is not working, but I think there's just too much prophecy of doom. We are just saying we don't know what.
Give us some hope. Tell us what to be done. Tell us.
No, I mean,
where is Zimbabwe? Tell us.
There are specific things like which are worrying people. Is exchange rate How are we dealing with bond notes and the like? These are things which are affecting people every day, and coming up with solutions to say from last time and the like. The business environment in terms of law has improved. We can't say it is still as bad as it was in 2000. Parastatals now are now being addressed. Corruption, we're hearing, although we don't know, people are getting in courts at least who were invisible. I mean, who knew Grace could, or Bona would go to court with one of these days, anytime last day. But people are asking, even former ministers, and what ICT, whatever, going into courts. So if we continue simply saying, maybe say affect it so that we see, but to see nothing is happening, then people will not listen. Because I was in China last week. There, sometimes we create more doom ourselves than the people who want to assist us, because we say our system doesn't work, but they see it works. What's the problem? You can do this, you can do this. They're looking for investments, but we're the first one to say, don't come here, don't come here. I think at some point we still have to live, because we live here. We have to continue giving confidence into ourselves. Yes, there are constraints, but if we only talk about constraints without talking about the hopes and aspirations of Zimbabwe.
Tell us, give us you're saying you're adding to the gloom. Tell us. Okay, I'll let the Chiza.
Thank you very much.
I also want to respond to you at some point.
Yeah,
I think like he says, your panelists paint a very dark, gloom picture of where we are going and where we're coming from. I would want to probably hear from them. Any one of them would want to probably answer. What is it that the current regime has done that you think is maybe not so progressive, but to use that word for lack of a better word, that you think is progressive or that could be worked on, that could be a foundation on which this country can be governed going forward?
You want to reply to your counterpart? The gift?
Yeah, I mean, to his point, when he was talking about the exchange ratings and stuff like that, I don't know whether you're aware that the economy is de-dollarized. We shouldn't even be talking about an exchange rate, but we commandeered a de-dollarization, and it should not have actually happened that way. So if you see people advancing policies that are counterproductive, there's nothing good to talk about. There's nothing. There's nothing to talk about.
And we want the solution to that, otherwise everyone is suffering because of that.
Well, sales are going to give a solution, so why do you leave her to talk?
Yeah, because that's exactly what I wanted to say. To say that when we actually come up with this point, and besides, to his point, there is no consultation when we come up with these policies. There has not been any policy reforms, so that at least we can appeal to the investor. Because if you look at Zimbabwe and you model it as a company, Zimbabwe should be a company that should be under judicial management. A different set of hands, to run it. Do you understand what I'm saying? With good, better ideas than what we are actually seeing at the moment. Do you understand what I'm saying? So there hasn't been any opportunity that has been extended to a different set of hands to run it. So you will never be able to proffer any solutions, unless if you are asked to proffer them, but you are not. We have got this very same set of minds who created the problems that we are looking at, who are supposed to be solving it. It's impossible. Isn't it?
Well, there you go. I'll take Mahomba, and then there's a hand at the back. Yes? Mahomba, and then you have the last.
Okay. So I think there is a submission that has been made, but I think it's very much connected to what Mr. Kanyenze raised. I think he gave us an overview of the crisis that we've had and all of that, but most importantly, I think what emerges from his submission is that we have got problems, and much of those problems emanate from the fact that citizens are not engaged in issues of policy making. So at the end of the day, it takes us back to another very fundamental issue to say, if November was revolutionary as some sectors of our policy, of our polity would want to argue, where the citizens then engaged to then manufacture consent on probably the idea of the Second Republic. So I think overall, what is then important is were the citizens involved in making up that which has been said to be the broader aspirations of what they want. And if that is not so, it means there is need to reconstruct policies with direct engagement of citizens for the benefit of the citizens and not political interests.
Thank you. Yes, sir. Your name, sir?
Yes, I am Tobias. My worry is on the question that is already made in the House on the fact that it was a coup. Whilst it could be that, but we need to take note of the fact that the general made it very clear in his statement that he was going for criminals that were surrounding the then president. And I'm not sure if we are reflecting or if we are implying that the same military were the actors in Highfield, around that same area, where almost most of the citizens rallied, including members of the opposition, in support of the act that we are now calling a coup. I'm not sure if we take it that way, but also we need to take note of the fact that even during the negotiations and even on the fateful day of Asante Sana, the soldiers that we saw were still giving their due respect to the head of state. At that point, I'm not sure if that makes up a coup, because I thought a coup would be constituted by a complete takeover by either the military or whoever is taking over. And the other issue here about that case of a coup is whether the constitution as it is was suspended. Whilst the advocate has highlighted a number of areas where the constitution might have been violated, but she also pointed out that there were a lot of effort that was made in order to address and legalize that issue. And we will all agree that the constitution was not suspended. The last point that I want to take is about the transition that Tony talked about. And this question was asked a bit earlier by another politician about transition to where. And I would raise the same question, but also take it further to the argument that people have stressed in this house about constitutionalism. If we are going to go into a transition, how far is it from our constitutional requirements and our constitutional needs? And as Zimbabweans, we have gone through these periods, and we know the history of the GPA or the GNU, and it was again an issue of bending the constitution to suit the requirements of the political parties. But I don't know why we want to take that turn again at this point in time, instead of maybe sticking to our constitution and refining and improving our adherence to that constitution. Thank you.
I'll have to defer to Violet again. Very last.
Mine is a question. I don't know if I heard right, but Mr. Shumba, Dr. Shumba, said that even the Chinese government no longer trust President Emerson Mnangagwa. So I was thinking, since the Chinese actually is here, maybe he might want to just respond to that. Is it true that this is now the policy that you no longer trust President Mnangagwa?
Well, that we are naughty.
And also just to talk, the second part, and also just to tell us a
We
bit
can
about
hear you, don't worry.
the mega deals. What is the Chinese government's policy, or the mega deals in Zimbabwe?
You were here 2 weeks ago, you spoke about mega deals. But answer the question if you want to. If you don't have to. No, you don't have to. Just acting ambassador.
You want the mic?
Yes,
You want the mic?
Also in my personal capacity, answer this question. First impression is that I can see that the issue still bewilders you and maybe many of the people here, whether it is a coup or not. And anyway, that this is internal politics. I won't join you in such kind of discussions, but I would like to just listen to the discussions. Number one. Number two is that on the Chinese, so you raise this issue, and so how can anybody else draw the conclusions for the Chinese government that say Chinese government doesn't have the confidence in Mnangagwa's government or in Mnangagwa? If we don't have confidence in him, how can we just immediately after at his inauguration we set special envoy here, and immediately after that we invite Emerson Mnangagwa to visit China, to pay a state visit to China. Very successful state visit. Then the relations between the two countries are upgraded to comprehensive strategic partnership of cooperation. And then immediately after that we send delegations after delegations of businessmen to do feasibility study here. And then after that we have several projects started and also commissioned. Harare International Airport, we have groundbreaking ceremony. Then we commissioned the Kariba South Extension Project. Then we started the Wangi Thermal Power Station. So all the facts speak volume. But I can still see that some people in Zimbabwe select not to see that, not see the facts. And today I also read the news, a piece of news in Newsday, to say that Zimbabwe doesn't benefit from the ties with China. So this is also a kind of fact that shows that some people select not to see that.
Newsday is here, Jesus.
Okay, I just want to point out that. So I think that I didn't want to list all those facts. Just another one that is tobacco industry, that every year we import $500 million worth of tobacco from Zimbabwe. And even half of the tobacco is exported to China. Okay, how can you see that we haven't done anything here? So I think that we should just wipe and clear the eyes and try to see who is supporting Zimbabwe, who is putting sanctions against Zimbabwe. Okay, we have been doing everything here. We try our best, but we still face some criticism. And some people, I can see that those countries put sanctions against Zimbabwe, but I seldom see, or I never see, those smart people, intellectuals, to criticize those people that put sanctions against Zimbabwe. Why? It's a little bit strange, right?
Thank you, Joe.
Anyway, these are my comments.
Thank you.
And so just to share my views with you.
No, I think you have answered very well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Daniel, quickly, and then Shingi last.
Thank you for your wonderful responses. And I'm sure those are one who's a diplomat who should answer. I'm clearly aware as chair of the committee in Parliament of more than $1 billion that was externalized from Marange through Botswana to China, and the Chinese government complained to President Mugabe and gave a list. Hotels that were bought by senior government officials in China. So what I then want you to know is that we know officially that what you're saying is correct. But your help to Zimbabwe has come at seriously compromised economic positions for Zimbabwe, especially in the extractive area. I had the privilege of being head of delegation for Zimbabwe to the EU Parliament, but as well as head of the Political Affairs Committee for SADC. So I'm aware of the contestation between the West and China, where they drive aid and you drive investment and loans. But clearly there are issues of the aggressive way in which you give the conditionalities and your participation in the economic structures of the country, especially Zimbabwe. You deployed over 4,000 Chinese to do extractive work in Marange only. Similarly in the platinum area. So it's one thing for the diplomatic position to be aired here and not mention the price that Zimbabwe is having to pay. It is also something that we must understand that your role with the military never came to Parliament. We did not debate it. And yet, it's everywhere in social media, where the hard iron hand, the financing of military equipment and weaponry, has not received parliamentary scrutiny. And that's again in violation of corporate governance. Yes, the West have put sanctions on Zimbabwe. It is wrong. We don't like it. But Zimbabwe has also invited those sanctions. So not putting sanctions on Zimbabwe does not necessarily mean you are working in Zimbabwe's best interest. Thank you.
Okay, very last.
Just one more, just make some comments. I think that we have a very good cooperation with Zimbabwe, and then we also have the cooperation in the diamond sector. Do you say that we deploy 4,000 people there, Chinese? I don't think it is completely wrong. And I know the company, and but I will never allow such kind of exaggeration. At most, we deploy around 100 or 70 people there, and we employ thousands of employees there. This is the ratio. Okay, so give me the evidence. If you say that 4,000 people, I can give you the evidence. How many people we employ, how many Chinese we deploy there. And we can also give you the evidence in Kariba South Extension Project that usually we have around 100 or 200 Chinese workers there. We employ thousands of local employees. So you must admit the facts that I must correct your mistake. And on the second issue is that in Cheswa, no plunder there, and we have a cooperation with Zimbabwean Defense Ministry or with the Ministry of Mining. We have cooperation with the government, and whenever there are any problems, they should or they will resolve these issues with us, and not Chinese plunder the wealth, but I believe that then government plunders the project. They just changed their policy suddenly and closed down the company. So the production of the diamond decreased dramatically from 30 million cataracts to 3 million carats of diamond. So we can see all the facts. Not the Chinese just to withdraw their equipment. It is closed down. Those Chinese investors also suffer great loss from it. So we cannot neglect the facts. And also the plunder, we say that $15 billion, you always mention that in your media, but actually it is nothing, it is not a fact. Even Mugabe clarified it in Herald, or they say that it is just a kind of a joke. Have you read that piece of news in Herald? Okay, but so anybody, if you say that $15 billion, we squander it or plunder it or take it, give me the evidence. Never make groundless accusations.
I'm willing to give you the evidence.
Okay, good. We talked about such issues for such a long time, but no evidence.
Kariba 87 was under Mugabe, not Mnangagwa.
Okay, finish. No, okay, fine. Now
I was hoping, before I forget, I directed the question to...
Yeah, you answer them. They're going to answer now.
Okay,
yeah.
Thanks.
Still, you don't need to like go to you.
Well, okay, there's a lot of different questions there. Impunity. Zimbabwe's got a world record for impunity. It starts before independence, and it's how we cure our disease. It's a bit like
We do bad things, and then we just cover them over. And it's not just formal impunity, we just do it again and again and again. And it's a serious